I was delighted by the way that Maureen mentioned in her talk in relation to the Claire McFall novel, the Powell and Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death. If you don't know that film, in fact, if you don't know Powell and Pressburger films, I urge you to find out about them. They're all marvellous films. That's a particularly brilliant one. And I think although it's now a very old film, must be about 60 years old, the way that it's made and the things it talks about, I think would work really well in conjunction with the Claire McFall novel. But in the bygoing, I would also say, please search out a film also by Powell and Pressburger called I Know Where I'm Going. An absolutely brilliant film, one of my top 3 or 4 films of all time. So go and explore those films if you don't know them. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to talk about Scots short fiction for early secondary school years, and I'm really going to talk about the stories in this wee book. I'm really chuffed at how good this has turned out. Many thanks to Duncan Jones for doing all the work on putting it together. A wonderful cover illustration, which is perfect, I think, for the story, The Manny, which I'll talk about in a wee minute. As Ronnie's already said, the Scottish Government has actually supported the publication of this, so there are multiple copies of this out there, and Duncan encourages you, I think, to take away whatever copies you might need for class sets and things. But even better, you can also download this from the ASLS website, so you don't have to have physical copies of the book to make it accessible to your students. So it's great that this is available. One of the things I think that is problematic for teachers in secondary schools is that although we've made quite a lot of headway in the last few years about getting Scots language into primary schools, the curriculum is so packed in secondary schools that it's quite difficult to find space to concentrate on the Scots language. And with the HEQ imprint, which I helped to co-found back in, goodness me, in 2002 now, so it's been going for a long time. We found that we've produced many books, but mainly aimed at the primary school age group. We have had some success with some secondary school texts, but not a huge amount. So it's good to add another wee book that's freely available to that list. One of the things that I find when I go into schools is that very often pupils, when they're faced with Scots language prose, they react quite badly when they first see it, because to them it looks often like a foreign language. And this is simply because they're not exposed to Scots on the printed page in the same way as they are to English, for obvious reasons. They may well be familiar with a Scots poem or two, that kind of thing, but when they see a set of pages with Scots in prose form, that can sometimes be quite challenging and quite difficult. And one of the ways that I have got around that in the past and encouraged teachers to get around it is to try and make the link between what they're seeing on the printed page and what they themselves would speak or what they would hear almost every day of their lives if they're in and around Scots-speaking communities, or if they themselves are Scots speakers. So I quite often do a wee thing where and I take one of the HEQ books, perhaps one of the Roald Dahl translations that we've done. Matthew Fitt, my colleague, translated the Twits by Roald Dahl as the Egypts. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that text. And what I've done in the past is I've taken a page or a section from that book, and I have, and this is where I'm breaking all the rules. I've made a photocopy of a single. A page from the original English text and a page from the Scots equivalent text, and I put them alongside each other. and handed those out to a class. And then I, either myself or the teacher, I'll start reading the English. I'll read the first sentence on the English side, and then I'll look for a volunteer to read the equivalent Scots sentence, and of course nobody wants to do it. But eventually somebody does. And what's remarkable is almost as soon as the first one does it, they go, oh, wait a minute, that's not as unfamiliar when I hear it as it looks on the page. And before you know it, they've all got their hands up, wanting to read the next sentence and the next sentence. So I would go through this text. I read the English sentence, they read the equivalent Scots sentence. And by the time they get to the bottom of the page, they're beginning to actually make the connection between what they're hearing and speaking and what they're seeing on the page. And it's one of those kind of light bulb moments. And I would really encourage you to try and experiment with that. If you're finding that there's a barrier, I remember somebody just in the last few days, I was at a Scots language conference at the end of last week, and somebody was saying that they were doing I can't remember what the text was now, but they were doing, it was Sunset Song. And there was a real resistance because folk were saying, what's this about? And we don't recognise this stuff. And that's not particularly difficult on the eye because Lewis Crassick Gibbon's work is fundamentally looks like English. It's just got a lot of Scots words in it and a lot of Scots syntax. But it's the same thing. Once they hear it read out loud or they start to read it out loud themselves, things become a wee bit easier. So that's one way of beginning to kind of break down that barrier, that visual oral barrier, as far as I see it. Now, this particular wee book, there are 4 stories in it, and I've written a wee introduction, just 3 or 4 pages, just to try and give you some ideas about how you might use these stories. It didn't really occur to me. I've also discovered, by the way, that there's one little error in it, which is my fault. But that's now become one of those deliberate mistake things. So I'm not going to tell you what it is. But it's tiny. It's not really important at all. But when I was selecting which stories might work in this context, I wanted to kind of grade them from sort of relatively easy access to a wee bit more challenging by the time you get to the 4th story. So they're kind of step-by-step stories that I think if you could use the first one with S1, S2, and then by the time you get to the final story, which is actually quite challenging, I think, in all kinds of ways, you're probably talking about the sort of top-end years in your schools. But having said that, there will always be readers who are ahead of the game and who will actually find, if they read this from start to finish, that they will actually be able to cope very easily with the 4th story, and there may be others who find that that they have to take a wee bit more time to get up to scratch with that kind of level of reading. But as I said, when I was putting this together, I didn't really think about this consciously, but one of the things that I've subsequently noticed is that all 4 of these stories are in the 3rd person, so they're 3rd person narratives. And that is quite unusual for a lot of Scots prose. It's very often the case that that I think that you see contemporary Scots writing being from a sort of internal monologue or with the narrator's point of view, which can lend itself really well to use of Scots, but it can also, I think, quite often fall back on some cliches and stereotypes about who would be speaking in that kind of voice. So there's an immediate difference in these stories in the sense that it's a 3rd person narrative that's going on, but the narratives are all slightly different. So there are questions there beyond the use of the language itself. I think there are questions that you can introduce while you're teaching these texts about a narrative voice and where the voice is coming from and whose voice it is. The second thing that I kind of realised when I was looking at these stories was that they are all pretty much set in mainly rural locations. And again, I hadn't really thought about that at the time, but they are not really, they're definitely not city city stories. And that in itself raises interesting questions about the particular type of Scots language that I've used in here. I've explained a wee bit about my own background. I grew up in an English-speaking household, English was not the habitual daily language that I used as a child. I've moved around as an adult all over the place, and I think I've picked up lots of different forms of Scots and so on over the years. I've lived in Edinburgh, I've lived in Glasgow, but I've also lived in rural Lanarkshire and in Fife and now in Angus. And I've been in Angus now for longer than I've been in any other place in my life. So I've kind of become immersed in a sort of more northeasterly rural Scots, perhaps. But what I write isn't specific to any one dialect. That may be problematic, or it may make things easier. I'm not quite sure. So there are some characteristics of these stories that maybe don't fit entirely with some of the other Scots prose that you may have used or read in the past. So let me just take you very quickly through the 4 stories. Starting with the first one, which is called Black Cuddy. This is a story was actually commissioned a few years ago by the Scottish Book Trust, and it takes the form of a young lassie going on a wee journey, as it were, and speaking to a number of different animals on the way out. Something happens when she gets to her destination, and then she comes back again and speaks to the same animals in reverse order. And I think I wrote this story round about the time that I was translating Julia Donaldson's The Gruffalo into Scots. And actually I think that would be a really useful text to use in conjunction with this. Because again, it's easy, everybody kens The Gruffalo. If they don't ken it in Scots, they definitely know it in English. And I think to actually run that text alongside this one would be quite an interesting thing to do, and would actually get perhaps some of your more reluctant pupils to engage with the story. So the lassie goes, she speaks, the animals speak back to her, they all have particular traits and characteristics. And there's a sort of lesson in the story as well, a sort of moral, if you like, when you get to the end. The last line of the story is she's speaking to the cuddy, Black Cuddy, the horse that she meets at the start of the story. And the horse says, she's met a clegg that has bitten her. And the horse says, well, what was that about? And she says, it was to learn me. To learn you? See, I wouldn't forget, she said. And that's the end of the story. And the question, I suppose, there is what is it that she's been learned not to forget? And I think the answer is, but one is never quite sure even when one writes these things. I think that the answer is that even a rural idyll isn't really a rural idyll unless it's got clegs in it. If you've got through that story, the next one in the book, The Manny, which is I don't think it's a more difficult story in terms of the language, but it's a quieter kind of story, and it's a more reflective kind of story, and it's a ghost story, which I think would be something that would appeal to a lot. So you could introduce it as a ghost story, and that hopefully would get the curiosity of some of your pupils up straight away. And I'm just going to read you a wee bit out loud of this, just the opening 2 or 3 paragraphs, just to give you a sense of what it sounds like rather than what it looks like. Dinna be feared, she tell't hersel. You can't help being what he is. Look at him. So she looked at him, and he looked back with a grey, searching een, as if he was wanting to tell her something. He was old, with siller bristles on his shafts, and thin patches of white hair on his head, like doon on a brown spreckled egg. A good-looking man, a wee bit bully back it, but he'd been tall yince, she could see that. He had on all grey working clothes, but nae bits, just grey socks on his feet. He'll hae ta'en them off at the back door, she thought, out of habit. The kindness in his face minded her o' her father. But this wasn't her father, he was lang dead. This was a mannie she'd never seen afore, stoning in the kitchen as if it was his ain. The next second he was awa. This shocked Elspeth mair than him he'd been there in the first place. She went to the back door just to check, but of course there were nae bits there. And when she came back, it was as if she'd no seen the mannie either. But she had. She wondered what it was he'd been wanting to tell her. Now, I think when you hear that, you realise that there's nothing too difficult about that, read out loud. And actually, looking on the page, there's only one or two wee words that might be difficult for some of your students. There is, at the back of the book, a glossary. It's pretty comprehensive. I haven't done every single word, but it's pretty comprehensive. But actually, I kind of always like to encourage readers, school students, not to go straight to the back of the book every time they've come across a word they don't understand. I try to say to them that they should try to use the context to find out the words. So a word like bully backet there, you can probably work out what it is just by listening to, by working out from the context. And chaft's another one that's clearly, you can work out from that it's his cheeks or his chops. So I feel that there are things that can be done there to, as it were, encourage the use of the glossary only as a last resort or as a second resort, rather than sort of breaking up the reading experience every 10 seconds just to check that you're right. So maybe one of the things to do there is to encourage that they read the story at least twice, and that they read it through the first time without the glossary, and then maybe at the end of having read it through the first time, they have a wee check with any of the words that they really didn't get, and then they read it through again and see how they got on the second time. The third story, again, it's a slightly different take on use of the language. It starts off in English, so there's a very clear distinction in this story between the English sections of the book, which kind of bookend of the story rather, which kind of bookend the story, and the main section in the middle, which is in Scots. And again, there's a sort of there's a wee bit more about a sort of city rurality kind of contrast here, because the man who is thinking back to his childhood he's living, or he's in a city where his office is in a skyscraper. So he's clearly no longer where the bulk of the story takes place, but he's thinking back to it. And as he thinks back, that memory also changes the language that's used in the story. And I think there's all kinds of interesting things that you can discuss with your pupils around that. What's the purpose of the change of the language? What does it tell you? Does it tell you anything positive or anything negative about the difference between English and Scots, and so on? And again, I think the language, the vocabulary in this particular story is maybe just a wee bit more tricky, or there's a wee bit more unusual vocabulary in this story from the first two. You've got words like yet for gate, flag for getting a fright, and so on. But again, I hope that in the context, it's not impossible to work out what these are without having to go straight to the glossary every single time. Yeah, it's as I said, it's an interesting structure to the story. I suppose that it's got this kind of real distinctive gap between the English on at the beginning and at the end, and the Scots in the middle. Again, in the very short introduction, I've talked a wee bit about each of the stories and why I've gone for particular density of language, if you like, density of Scots in each one, and also that thing about how in my fiction, in my novels, the base language is English, but there's a lot of Scots in them. This is the reverse, in the sense that the base language in here is Scots, but there are also English words in here, and that begs all kinds of interesting questions about what is the difference between Scots and English. Again, at the Scots Language Conference that I was at last week, I was really frightened of that could degenerate into another bloody endless discussion about defining Scots. You know, is it a language, is it a dialect, and so on, which frankly bores me rigid these days. I'm fed up with it. The fact of the matter is that wherever you are in Scotland, Scots exists. You'd have to be deaf not to recognise that. You know, everywhere you go, whether it's Glaswegian Scots, Dundonian Scots, Angus Scots, or any other kind of Scots. So at one level, I feel that all of that stuff about defining it is actually gets in the road of and blocks people actually really experiencing it as a written language as well as a spoken and heard language. But there are obviously really interesting questions to be discussed, and I think, again, thinking about what Maureen said, Scots language lends itself really easily to going off into all kinds of different directions in curriculum for excellence terms. You can use the Scots language to get to all kinds of other places in your discussions, and it's not just about language and literature. It goes into all kinds of other places, and in this particular book there could be, for example, quite a big discussion about the difference between rural Scotland and urban Scotland. And there could also be a big discussion about younger people's use of Scots and older people's use of Scots. I'm very conscious don't know how it happened, Julie, but I'm very conscious that I've now got a bus pass. And so I am very conscious that the Scots that I use in my writing is to some extent an old-fashioned kind of Scots. It's not as old-fashioned as the Scots that I used to hear when I was growing up, and it's not as old-fashioned as some of the Scots that I've read. Nevertheless, it is different from folk who are 30 or 40 years younger than me. And I think that's a totally fascinating and valid place and area of discussion. So let me just finish very quickly with telling you a wee bit about the last story in the book, and we maybe will have time for a couple of questions at the end. The final story is a translation of quite a well-known story by Guy de Maupassant. I've actually translated a few Maupassants, and I want to actually get a complete collection of these together because I love his writing. I think, well, he wrote an awful lot of stories in a very, very short space of time, and some of them are terrible, but some of them are absolutely brilliant. And the best of them, I think, are great. And this one's one of his famous ones. It's called in French Le Diable, the deal, and it's really about human greed and grippiness, if you like. It's about a peasant who's wanting to get his harvest in, but his mother is dying and he can't leave her unattended. So he basically strikes up a deal with I was going to say the equivalent of a Macmillan Nuss, but she's not really a Macmillan Nuss because they're brilliant and she's terrible. Anyway, it ends up being about money and how much he's going to pay her to look after his mother, and he's really tight-fisted and she's just as tight-fisted. So I'll give you a wee bit. Basically, the doctor says you can't leave her on her own, but I know you've got to get your harvest in, so go and get Ma Rapé. She looks after all the folk when they're on their last legs, as it were, when they're dying. So he goes away to see her, and she's a washerwoman, and she makes shrouds for the dead, and she does washing and knitting, and needlework and all that kind of stuff, and she never stops. So he goes over to see her. "Aye, Bill," he says, "who's all with you? Who's all with yourself, Ma Rapé?" She turned her head to see him. "Oh, just dinna wa. And yourself?" "Oh, I'm fine. My mother's no so good." "Your mother?" "Aye, my mother. What's wrong with your mother?" "Oh, she's about ready to turn her face to the wall. There's just that." The old wife took her hands out of the water. Transparent blue blade drops ran down to her fingernails. Sign fell back into the bin. She's starching the local women's ruffs and collars while she's doing this. She's speared with a quick sympathy. "Is she that far gone?" "Oh, the doctor says she's past coming back." "She must be bad then." Honoré had himself back. He was ranging through the different ways he might put his proposition to her, but finding none of them any use, he broke out all of a sudden, "What's your price for looking after her?" She says, "Awa, you ken I'm no rich. I can't even pay for a housemaid. That's what's brought it to this. My poor mother, our muckle care and our muckle darg. She did the work at 10. Never mind her 90 years. They didn't mak her kind ony mair." Ma Rapé answered him dourly, "There's 2 rates, 2 francs a day, 3 francs a nicht for the gentry, 1 franc a day and 2 francs a nicht for everybody else. For you, it'll be 1 and 2. No, I'd rather you give me the 1 price, a price for the whole job. I'm taking a chance, yin way or t'other. The doctor says she'll be awa any time now. If that's the way you win, I lose. But if she hangs on to the morn or langer, I win, you lose." The nurse gave him a swipper look. She'd never yet put a bet on somebody doing. She hesitated, tempted with the thought of striking it lucky, and signed she'd lose that he was Ertland to Swicker. "I'm no saying aye or no till I've seen your mother," she said. "I will," he said. "Come on and see her." So this is the deal, and basically the poor old wife is no dying fast enough, so she has to get speeded up a wee bit. Anyway, that's the gist of it. But it's really, I mean, they're no nice folk, but it's a great story. I love it. There's, as you can probably have gathered already, there's quite a lot of more difficult Scots in there. "Sign should you lose that he was Etland to Swicker." That's quite a difficult sentence, and that's why I would say don't throw them in at the deep end with this story. Let them build up to it. But I can remember reading, when I was quite young, Thrawn Janet by Robert Louis Stevenson, and not having a clue what was going on in it because I wasn't familiar with so many of the words. But I didn't care because it was so fascinating trying to work my way through this language and work my way through this weird, dark story. And I think there will always be pupils in your classes who will respond in that kind of way to reading work in Scots. And they may not get it all first time through, they may not get it through third time through, but it'll stick in their heads and they'll come back to it in later years. So I hope that this wee book, either in download form or in the form it's in, and it's actually really attractive, so it's not too intimidating this. It's only 30, 40 pages. But I really hope that this might intrigue some of your pupils and intrigue yourselves, but it might actually open the door for them to read a bit more widely in Scots. And there is now plenty out there in Scots. So I'll leave it at that and hope you make some good use of it. Thanks.